October 25, 1944. USS Franklin, somewhere in the Philippine Sea. Radio operator Third Class Michael Chen pressed his headphones tight against his ears, straining to catch the faint, static-filled transmission from the forward picket destroyers. What he heard made his blood freeze. Dozens of aircraft approaching fast from the northeast. But these weren't ordinary bombing runs. Intelligence had confirmed it weeks ago. The Japanese had embraced a new tactic that defied all military logic. Pilots with no intention of returning home. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The Kamikaze had arrived. Above deck, gunner's mate Robert Sullivan watched the horizon through binoculars, scanning for the telltale dots that meant death was diving from the sky. The ship's conventional anti-aircraft guns were already trained skyward, ready to throw up a wall of steel. But Sullivan didn't know that hidden deep within the shells loaded into those guns was a secret so revolutionary that it would turn the tide of the Pacific War. A tiny electronic brain that could think faster than any human reflexes, calculate distances with mathematical precision, and detonate at the perfect moment to shatter aircraft into fragments. The Proximity-Fuze was about to meet its ultimate test against an enemy that welcomed death. The problem had tormented Allied naval commanders since Pearl Harbor. Anti-aircraft gunnery was an exercise in calculated futility. A 5-inch shell traveling at 1,500 feet per second had to intercept an aircraft moving at 300 miles per hour in three-dimensional space. The mathematics were brutal. Traditional shells relied on contact fuses. They had to physically strike their target to explode. Against maneuverable aircraft, the hit probability was less than 1%. Commander William Hayes of the Naval Ordnance Laboratory understood the grim arithmetic better than most. He had spent months analyzing combat reports from the early Pacific engagements, watching American ships pour thousands of rounds into the sky, only to watch Japanese bombers slip through the barrage unscathed. The USS Lexington had fired over 3,000 anti-aircraft rounds during the Battle of the Coral Sea. Direct hits, 7. The devastating mathematics meant that for every enemy aircraft destroyed, American ships expended enough ammunition to supply a small army. But Hayes had been working on something that would change those odds forever. Something so sensitive that only 12 people in the entire United States government knew of its existence. Deep in the classified laboratories of Johns Hopkins University, a team led by physicist Dr. Margaret Thornton had been developing a shell fuse that didn't need to hit its target. It only needed to get close. The Proximity-Fuze was a miracle of miniaturized electronics crammed into a space smaller than a coffee cup. A tiny radio transmitter sent out continuous signals as the shell flew through the air. When those radio waves reflected off a target and returned to the receiver, the fuse calculated the distance and detonated at the optimal range for maximum destruction. The engineering challenges had been staggering. The fuse had to survive the violent acceleration of being fired from a naval gun, withstand the spinning motion that kept the shell stable in flight, and function reliably in combat conditions ranging from tropical heat to Arctic cold. Dr. Thornton's team had solved problems that seemed impossible. They created vacuum tubes small enough to fit inside a shell, yet robust enough to survive forces that would crush a normal radio. They developed timing circuits precise enough to measure microseconds while spinning at 3,000 revolutions per minute. They designed antennas that could transmit and receive while traveling faster than the speed of sound. The Proximity-Fuze represented a quantum leap in military technology, incorporating advances in electronics, metallurgy, and physics that wouldn't appear in civilian applications for decades. The first successful test occurred on August 12, 1942, at the Dahlgren Naval Proving Ground in Virginia. Test Director Captain James Morrison watched through armored glass as a drone aircraft approached the test range. The experimental shell burst 50 feet from the target, its fragments shredding the aircraft's wings and sending it tumbling into the Potomac River. Morrison's hands shook as he reached for the secure telephone to Washington. After months of failures and near misses, they had finally achieved controlled proximity detonation. Production began immediately under the tightest security measures of the war. The Proximity-Fuze was classified above top secret, given a security rating higher than the Manhattan Project itself. Workers at the manufacturing facilities didn't know what they were building. Components were produced at separate locations and assembled under armed guard. Even the shipping containers were designed to self-destruct if tampered with. The fear was simple. If this technology fell into enemy hands, it could be reverse-engineered and turned against Allied aircraft. By early 1943, the first proximity-fused shells were arriving in the Pacific Theater. They came with strict handling instructions and elaborate security protocols. Gun crews were told only that these were experimental rounds with improved accuracy. The shells looked identical to conventional ammunition, except for small coded markings that only ordnance officers could interpret. Loading procedures remained the same, but the combat effectiveness was about to increase by orders of magnitude. The initial deployment was limited to the most critical engagements. Admiral Raymond Spruance, commanding Task Force 58, received authorization to use the new ammunition during the Gilbert Islands campaign. His ships carried a mixed load, conventional contact-fused rounds for surface targets and the revolutionary proximity-fused shells reserved exclusively for aircraft. The gun crews didn't know they were about to witness the most dramatic improvement in naval air defense since the invention of radar. Lieutenant Commander David Park of the destroyer USS O'Brien studied the technical manual for the new ammunition in his cabin, trying to understand the cryptic references to variable time fuses and proximity detonation. The specifications seemed too good to be true. Effective burst radius increased from 15 feet to 150 feet. Hit probability improved from less than 1% to over 20%. If the numbers were accurate, a single ship could put up a defensive barrage equivalent to an entire squadron using conventional ammunition. The Japanese, meanwhile, remained completely unaware of this technological revolution brewing in American arsenals. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means their intelligence networks had detected increased anti-aircraft production, but attributed it to normal wartime expansion. Japanese pilots continued training for conventional attack patterns, practicing the high-speed, low-altitude approaches that had proven effective against traditional defensive fire. They developed tactics based on the assumption that American gunners would continue missing 99% of their shots. Vice Admiral Takeo Kurita, planning the Japanese counterattack in the Philippines, based his calculations on combat reports from earlier engagements. American ships typically required several minutes of concentrated fire to down a single aircraft. His attack plans allocated sufficient aircraft to overwhelm defensive positions through sheer numbers. The mathematical models showed that even with heavy losses, enough Japanese planes would survive to reach their targets and inflict decisive damage. The stage was set for one of the most shocking tactical surprises in naval history. Japanese attack formations, trained to exploit the weaknesses of conventional anti-aircraft fire, were about to encounter a defensive system that could reach out and destroy aircraft at ranges they thought were safe. The Proximity-Fuze would turn the sky around American ships into a killing field where survival became a matter of pure chance rather than pilot skill. Weather reports for October 25th showed clear skies over the Philippine Sea. Visibility unlimited. Wind from the southeast at 12 knots. Perfect conditions for the largest naval air battle of the Pacific War. In the ready rooms of Japanese carriers, pilots received their final briefings, studying photographs of American ship formations and discussing attack vectors. They had trained for this moment for months, perfecting the split-second timing required to penetrate concentrated anti-aircraft fire. None of them knew that the rules of aerial combat had fundamentally changed. The Proximity-Fuze was about to transform the skies over the Pacific into a technological slaughter that would shatter the myth of the divine wind and herald the beginning of the end for Japanese naval aviation. The mathematical certainty of death was about to shift decisively in favor of the defenders, and the kamikaze pilots climbing into their cockpits that morning would be the first to discover just how deadly precision engineering could be when applied to the ancient art of war. November 1st, 1944. USS Intrepid, Task Force 38. The morning air crackled with tension as radar operator Seaman First Class Thomas Walsh watched the green phosphorescent dots multiply across his scope. 43 aircraft inbound from bearing 090, range 60 miles and closing fast. This wasn't a reconnaissance flight or a scattered bombing attempt. The formation was too large, too coordinated, too determined. Admiral William Halsey's voice echoed through the ship's communication system, calm but urgent. "All hands, general quarters, air attack imminent. This is not a drill." Gun Captain Stanley Rodriguez felt the familiar weight of responsibility settle on his shoulders as his crew scrambled to their positions around the 5-inch dual-purpose mount. They had drilled this scenario hundreds of times, but today felt different. The ammunition handlers were loading shells marked with small red triangles, the mysterious new rounds that had arrived under heavy security just 2 weeks earlier. Rodriguez had been briefed on their enhanced capabilities, but remained skeptical. In his experience, experimental weapons usually failed when you needed them most. The Japanese formation approaching Task Force 38 represented the largest kamikaze assault yet attempted. Vice Admiral Takejiro Onishi had spent weeks planning this coordinated strike, selecting pilots based on their technical skill and spiritual commitment. These weren't desperate recruits pressed into suicidal service. They were experienced aviators who had volunteered for the special attack units, men who had spent months training for this single moment when they would guide their aircraft into American warships with mathematical precision. Lieutenant Yukio Matsumoto led the first wave, flying a Mitsubishi A6M0 loaded with a 500-pound bomb. His approach strategy was based on intelligence gathered from previous kamikaze attacks. American anti-aircraft fire was intense but inaccurate. The key was to maintain high speed and use evasive maneuvers until the final dive. Once within 2,000 yards of the target, survival became irrelevant. The only objective was to ensure the aircraft reached its destination. The first proximity-fused shells left the barrels of American guns at 08:47 hours. Rodriguez watched through his optical sight as the tiny specks of Japanese aircraft grew larger against the morning sky. The conventional wisdom said to wait until targets were within effective range, roughly 3,000 yards for reliable hits. But the new ammunition had different parameters. The fire control officer had authorized engagement at maximum range, nearly twice the distance of conventional shells. What happened next defied every expectation based on previous naval engagements. The first salvo of proximity-fused shells detonated in perfect spherical bursts throughout the Japanese formation. Aircraft that should have been safely beyond effective range suddenly found themselves flying through clouds of metal fragments moving at supersonic speeds. The lead Zero, piloted by Matsumoto, simply disintegrated as hundreds of shell fragments shredded its aluminum structure. There was no time for evasive action, no warning of incoming fire. One moment the aircraft was intact, the next it was falling debris scattered across a square mile of ocean. The psychological impact on the surviving Japanese pilots was immediate and devastating. Everything they had been trained to expect about American defensive fire proved wrong. The protective distance they had relied on no longer existed. Aircraft were exploding at ranges where they thought they were invulnerable. The careful tactical formations dissolved into chaos as pilots instinctively broke away from the killing zones, abandoning coordinated attack patterns in favor of individual survival. Petty Officer Second Class James Chen, manning a 40mm mount on the USS Cabot, watched in amazement as Japanese aircraft fell from the sky like mechanical rain.
His battery was equipped with proximity-fused rounds for the smaller caliber weapons, extending the defensive umbrella down to altitudes where individual fighters might attempt low-level attacks. The increased lethality was stunning. Aircraft that managed to survive the 5-inch barrage found themselves flying into an additional layer of precisely timed explosions that left no gaps in the defensive coverage. The mathematical transformation was staggering. Where American ships had previously required an average of 2,600 rounds to destroy a single attacking aircraft, the proximity fuse reduced that number to fewer than 100 rounds per kill. The ammunition expenditure dropped by a factor of 26, while the destruction rate increased exponentially. Japanese attack formations that should have been able to overwhelm defensive positions through numerical superiority found themselves decimated before reaching effective attack range. Commander Hiroshi Nakamura, leading the second wave of kamikaze aircraft, watched the first formation disintegrate with growing horror.
Radio transmissions filled with panic and confusion as pilots reported weapons effects they couldn't understand. Aircraft were exploding without being hit directly. The American shells seemed to possess an almost supernatural ability to detonate at precisely the right moment for maximum destruction. Nakamura had trained his pilots to expect heavy losses, but not total annihilation at extreme range. The tactical doctrine that had governed naval air combat since the beginning of the war collapsed in a matter of minutes. Japanese pilots discovered that every assumption about American defensive capabilities was now obsolete. The safe approach distances had been cut in half. The protective value of speed and maneuverability had been largely negated. Even aircraft that survived the initial barrage found themselves damaged by fragments, their control systems compromised, their ability to carry out precision attacks destroyed. Dr. Margaret Thornton, monitoring radio communications from the Naval Research Laboratory in Washington, listened to the first combat reports with a mixture of professional satisfaction and personal horror. Her electronic brainchild was performing exactly as designed, but the human cost was becoming apparent. Japanese pilots were dying at rates that exceeded even the most optimistic projections. The proximity fuse wasn't just improving defensive effectiveness, it was creating a technological massacre. The intelligence implications became clear within hours. Japanese commanders had based their attack strategies on historical data showing American defensive limitations. The sudden appearance of dramatically improved anti-aircraft effectiveness suggested either a fundamental change in tactics or the deployment of new technology. Radio intercepts indicated confusion and speculation among Japanese air units, but the truth remained hidden behind layers of American security classification. Admiral Chester Nimitz, receiving the first detailed reports from Task Force 38, understood immediately that the balance of naval air warfare had shifted permanently. The proximity fuse gave American ships a decisive advantage in defensive engagements. More importantly, it meant that kamikaze attacks, which had relied on overwhelming defensive positions through numerical superiority, would no longer be tactically viable. The Japanese had traded their most experienced pilots for a strategy that was now obsolete. The technical success of the proximity fuse created unexpected operational problems. American ships were destroying attacking aircraft so efficiently that opportunities for combat experience and tactical development were disappearing. Gun crews accustomed to lengthy engagements found themselves facing empty skies within minutes of initial contact. The psychological adjustment was significant. Sailors who had expected desperate battles found themselves witnessing one-sided technological demonstrations. Lieutenant Charles Morrison of the USS Essex documented the changing nature of air defense in his personal diary. The old anti-aircraft battles had been contests of skill, timing, and determination. Gun crews had to lead their targets, estimate range and bearing, and hope for favorable circumstances. The proximity fuse reduced much of this human element to simple mathematics. The shells calculated their own detonation points with electronic precision, removing guesswork from the equation. The Japanese response was swift but ultimately futile. Intelligence officers attempted to recover fragments from the new American shells, hoping to understand the mechanism behind their improved effectiveness.
Captured material provided few clues. The proximity-fuse components were designed to self-destruct upon detonation, leaving only tiny pieces of metal and plastic that revealed nothing about the underlying technology. Even intact shells that failed to explode were equipped with anti-tampering devices that destroyed the sensitive electronic components if removal was attempted. Vice Admiral Onishi found himself facing an impossible tactical problem. The kamikaze strategy depended on accepting heavy losses in exchange for inflicting decisive damage on American naval forces. But if the loss rate increased to the point where no aircraft survived to reach their targets, the entire concept became militarily pointless. The proximity fuse had transformed what should have been costly but achievable attacks into suicide missions with virtually no probability of success. The ripple effects extended throughout the Japanese military hierarchy. Pilots who had volunteered for kamikaze missions began requesting transfers to conventional units. Training programs designed to produce special attack unit volunteers found themselves with decreasing numbers of candidates. The spiritual appeal of dying for the emperor diminished when death became certain while success became impossible. Weather conditions on November 15th were ideal for the next major kamikaze assault. Japanese meteorologists predicted clear skies and favorable winds for the largest coordinated attack yet attempted. Over 200 aircraft would participate, launched from bases throughout the Philippines in carefully timed waves designed to saturate American defensive systems. The attack plan represented months of preparation and the commitment of Japan's remaining experienced naval aviators. The American fleet awaiting this assault carried an entirely different type of ammunition than had been available just 6 months earlier. Every major caliber weapon, from 5-inch guns down to 20mm cannons, was loaded with proximity-fused rounds. The defensive umbrella around Task Force 38 had become a 3-dimensional killing field where aircraft survival was measured in seconds rather than minutes. Radio intercepts revealed Japanese confidence in the upcoming attack. Pilots had been briefed on new tactics designed to counter American defensive improvements. High-speed approaches would minimize exposure time. Multiple simultaneous attack vectors would divide defensive fire. Low-altitude final approaches would use the ocean surface to mask radar detection. The tactical modifications represented the best thinking of Japanese naval aviation, refined through months of combat experience and careful analysis of previous engagements. None of these adaptations addressed the fundamental change in American defensive capabilities. The proximity fuse didn't rely on visual tracking or predictive firing solutions. It created lethal zones around each shell that extended far beyond the physical dimensions of the projectile itself. Aircraft could no longer find safe corridors through defensive fire because the shells themselves created those killing zones through electronic calculation rather than human estimation. The morning of November 15th would witness the most technologically one-sided naval air battle in history. Japanese pilots flying into what they expected to be concentrated but survivable defensive fire would instead encounter a systematic demonstration of how advanced electronics could transform the mathematics of aerial combat. The divine wind was about to discover that American industrial ingenuity had found a way to make the sky itself lethal to those who dared to challenge it. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.